Another week, another fresh round of crisis for the Labour Party, which means a nightmare for the rest of us. Are they going to cut our spending, or are they going to raise our taxes?
And of course, it all means more tricky parliamentary handling for the Prime Minister. I think I've got PTSD coming back from my days with Theresa May and Boris Johnson, you know, Tim. That's what sort of caught her out in the end, because she was aloof, essentially. Yeah. And Starmer's got the same thing. Every time he says, I'm not interested in politics, I basically think it's sort of nonsense, mean girls stuff.
Yeah.
He's exposing himself massively, because people think you're aloof and you don't want to. Why don't you want to be my friend, Keir?
Cleo, you are a former number 10 advisor under Boris Johnson, so you're the perfect person to have on the show in this week of chaos and drama. Let's consider where things now stand. Last week, the welfare bill failed because of the backbench rebellion. The Chancellor of the Exchequer cried live on TV. And towards the end of the week, an ex-Labour MP announced she was joining a new party, possibly with Jeremy Corbyn, but that's not quite confirmed yet. It already feels like the Splinter group has splintered. So now Rachel Reeves starts this week having to find £5 billion because of the failure of the welfare bill. She won't borrow because of her fiscal rules. So the big question is she going to cut spending or raise taxes? Over the weekend, Bridget Phillipson refused to rule out scrapping what are called education, health and care plans. For those who don't know, and I do happen to know about this because one of my relatives has one, these are legally binding certificates that state what a council is obliged to provide for a child with special educational needs or disabilities. And they can be very expensive because they can, for instance, stipulate that the child has to be sent to a private school for those kind of children, which can incur massive fees. Here is Bridget Phillipson talking to Laura Kunsberg on the BBC.
We will strengthen and put in place better support for children. But I do just need to put this in the wider context of where we are at the moment, because this is, as you say, a complex and sensitive area where I've been spending a lot of time listening to parents, to disability rights groups, to campaigners and to others, and to colleagues across Parliament as well, because it's important to get this right. Now, it is tough, and there's a reason that the Conservatives ducked this and didn't look at it properly. We'll be setting out a schools white paper in the autumn that will set out wider reform, and it is important. I mean, I understand for parents, having access to that EHCP and what that brings is incredibly important.
But will you rule out getting rid of them?
I will make sure that every child gets the support maintained that they need.
But that's not
actually,
the question.
it's about better. It is about better and earlier support.
Cleo, this is a really difficult one to reform.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, it's another difficult one to go for. I mean, it's interesting that the first thing you said about this exact subject was, I know somebody who, and it's like the winter fuel payment cut and the welfare cut. Lots of people in the round think we need to cut the bill on these things. We're spending too much money. It's bloated. And actually, there's a particular subsection of parents who think that, let's say, children are being overdiagnosed with ADHD, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the problem is that everybody knows someone who desperately relies on this kind of support. And the people who do rely on it are very, very involved and vocal about it as well. So it's just like another classic row to stumble into. And I've actually wondered whether this is something that Phillipson's been thinking about anyway.
Right.
And she's just sort of put up a balloon to see how people respond.
Right.
Which does happen. You have this sense of pitch rolling in government where you can float out a story and see how particularly MPs respond, and then you can focus group it in a week's time, because you'll see, people will have seen it in the news and they'll have a sense of what they think. I think I'm probably being a bit generous giving that method to some of the madness, but again, like the winter fuel payments and welfare, this is something where you can sound quite reasonable, and you don't need to scare people, and you don't have to always look like the bad guys. But inexplicably, that has managed to happen again.
Yeah.
Because she just didn't sound reassuring enough. And sometimes there's a way to just answer these questions where you can kind of you maybe can give yourself sufficient wiggle room, but if they're going to go back on it, they're going to go back on it anyway. And it's she'll sound like she's broken a promise either way, the way she's phrased her answer to Laura's question there.
Yeah.
So you may as well try and really reassure people at this stage of the parliamentary term, or you have to be quite seriously going around and focus grouping your own MPs and getting a sense of where they actually sit on this stuff, and is there a way to package it up in the same way that you can talk about small boats. Smash the gangs is just inherently a more reassuring message than we must let people drown in the channel.
Right.
We need to find like we need to find a baddies here.
Yes.
And that's what we turn it into. And there's been this sort of sense in the government so far that they're willing to grasp a few nettles, but they will let it go as soon as it stings them. And
right.
I've got a few thoughts on MP handling, which I'm sure we can get into.
Hold that thought. I mean, one reason why a lot of us know someone with a certificate is because 639,000 children get one of these certificates, a figure that has nearly doubled in 6 years. And what I find astonishing is that of that figure, the percentage of kids with a certificate who have a severe learning disability or a physical disability makes up less than 10%.
That's right.
So a lot of that is diagnosis with ADHD, autism, anxiety, etc. But having said that, there's one part of me that thinks, okay, we can crack down on this. We can cut some of that number. But when I think of my relative that has a certificate, I instantly think, but not him.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
He deserves it.
Yeah.
So this is the problem, isn't it, right? That it's one of those where we might all, in principle, say, yeah, this is somewhere we're spending too much money, but it's kids.
Yeah.
And the kid who gets it, you instantly think, but that child should keep it.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people, and particularly this huge glut of new Labour MPs who've gone into Parliament, who did not come in to cut benefits and support for the very old, the very young, the disabled, the people who can't go back. I mean, it does not scream sort of the left politics. And the problem is that if you really mean this stuff and you're saying we really have to plug this fiscal hole and we just have a few lean years coming up, everybody, but then you do change your mind in the end, going so far as to say this is a confidence vote in the Prime Minister and then rolling over anyway.
Well, you're supposed to do the tough stuff in the first year.
Yeah, I mean, with Johnson's administration, we did the tough stuff in the first 3 months. I mean, he de-whipped 21 MPs who rebelled against him.
Right.
We de-whipped Roy Stewart and Philip Hammond and Nicholas Soames and Ken Clarke. I mean, that was
let's come in a second to how you handle a revolt. I just want to throw in, because, of course, if you don't cut spending, what you do instead is raise taxes. And this is where we just need to hear from Neil Kinnock talking to Trevor Phillips on Sky.
You wouldn't have to touch assets of under 6 or 7 million. So people's houses would be secure, obviously. But even by going for an imposition of 2% on asset values above 10 million, say, which is a very big fortune, the government would be in a position to collect 10 or 11 billion a year. Now, it's not going to pay all the bills, but it does two things, or that kind of levy does two things. One is to secure resources, which is very important, revenues. But the second thing it does is to say to the country, we are the government of equity. And this is a country which is very substantially fed up with the fact that whatever happens in the world, whatever happens in the UK, the same interests come out on top, unscathed all the time, while everybody else is paying more for gutted services.
It's not just a revenue raiser, it sends a message. This is the idea of a wealth tax. Respond to that. How do you feel about that idea that we should have a tax because it sends a message?
I mean, I actually think that a lot of people are feeling, obviously a lot of people are feeling the squeeze, but a lot of people feel that certain people are not.
Right.
And I don't think this is universally now a sort of left point anymore. There are lots of sort of comfortable-ish middle-class people who feel they're being squeezed very, very hard, and that perhaps the boss of their company isn't in quite the same way. They know what he earns.
Yes.
He's into a tax bracket where he can afford a clever accountant, and he perhaps isn't paying his way in the same, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
I think taxes to make a point is just, it's just not good politics, and it always comes back to bite you in the bottom. You know, it's a bit like Kerry Badenoch's team last week saying that Rachel Reeves should disclose her private matter. In fact, all private matters should now be disclosed from now on. And you just think, what an incredibly silly precedent to set. People are allowed some private life. But I don't think that is a good argument for the left to make. But I do think there are enough fed up people who think 2% on 10 million doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
But it will chase away wealth creators, won't it?
But this is where Labour have to make a decision, don't they? Are they about growth and wealth creators and being on the side of some business, or are they about kind of welfare and support for people and what many in their party think is, quote, fair?
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult tension. And in some ways, I'm sure we'll get into this, but the Splinter group of Corbyn and Zara Sultana and so on is quite helpful, I think, for the current number 10 team in the government, because it's quite hard to attack people who are technically within your own side and loyal, but now they have a they who can take on that message and run with it and see how they get on with it if they want. And I'm sure people within the Labour Party are welcome to go and join that group anytime they like, but they have people they can actually attack, which is actually easier than having just troublemakers within your own party who are pushing you in a particular direction, depending on
it's
how
a
strong
problem
they
if
are.
it splits the vote.
Yes.
Later down the line in the local elections next year or the general election, if it takes, some people said, about 10% of the vote for Corbyn's new party, that would be obviously a problem. But I agree with you in parliamentary terms. What have they lost here? Jeremy Corbyn, we don't even know if he's in the new party yet, is already an independent. Zara Sultana had already had the whip taken away.
Yeah.
So they've actually lost no one over this yet.
Yeah.
But also, will some Labour MPs be thinking, because they won the welfare vote last week, we're powerful now. We don't need to join a splinter group, because haven't we already hit the point in this government where it's already caving to its backbenchers, like Theresa May found herself doing?
Yeah, and indeed Boris Johnson in the end.
Right.
But I think in some ways it's more and less complicated than that, which is when you have a big majority like this, it sounds amazing, but obviously those are individual people with individual thoughts, and anyone who runs for public office does have, I would argue, not a brilliant chunky bit of Venn diagram between self-awareness and and sort of self-importance. And you've seen some of these stories. I'm sure listeners have heard stories about I've not even met the Prime Minister yet, and this sense of wanting to feel loved and lushed up, which Johnson used to talk to us about all the time. Well, we've got to show these guys some love.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem is, and we had the same thing with the Blue Wall, is that a lot of Starmer's MPs will have come in and they'll be looking at 5 years' time and they know they haven't got a snowball's chance in hell of getting re-elected. Yeah. In which case, why toe the party line and be helpful and stand around if you're, I don't know, trying to get into I'm a Celebrity, or you're thinking of your career after this? Yeah. You're not actually incentivized to be that loyal. You're actually incentivized to be a sort of Lee Anderson character and be loud and potentially look around for splinter parties, because if reform's taught them anything, it's that you can sort of find a spiritual home that can be successful.
Yes, that risk might pay off.
Absolutely.
That gamble might pay off of going third party.
Absolutely. And the other problem with parliamentary handling Starmer's got at the moment is that he's jettisoned a load of sort of old-timers to the backbenchers as well, who know they haven't got a chance of coming back to serve as ministers. And that is also a problem. There were lots of dissatisfied people who I suspect within a year or so will be getting knighthoods and damehoods and other little juicy things to keep them going. Yeah. There'll be a summer of Checkers barbecues, of trying to sort of lush everybody up, get away from the cameras, get away from the leather benches of the House of Commons, and just spend time together. Bring your spouse, as they like to do. Bring your family.
And was Boris good at that?
He was not as interested in that. He was better at going into the tea room and chatting, and and he was a serial texter and caller. Theresa May was less good at the sort of going into the tea room and making an impact with a self-deprecating joke, arguably. But she really worked hard at inviting people to Chequers and things like that. We were always hosting drinks parties where people could do things like bring their association chairman.
Right.
Or something at
And
Chequers.
she was a party machine person.
She was a party machine, and the other thing she was very good at, and again, these are all lessons for Keir Starmer's team, she had a very, very good political office, which incidentally I worked in.
Right.
And she did things like every time an MP had a birthday, had a baby, had some kind of family loss, she handwrote them a card or letter.
Interesting.
Which actually is not very much of her time at all.
Yeah.
She doesn't get to see everybody and lush them up all the time, but that really means something to people, and they keep that and they frame it and put it in their downstairs loo.
I've still got my Christmas card from Tony Blair.
There you go. These things matter, and
they really do. Right.
And when we're hearing these stories of Starmer's MPs being so dissatisfied and cross and that he doesn't make an effort, if his team were just doing some legwork for him...
Isn't part of the problem here, Cleo, that he doesn't like politics or parliament? And the interviews that came out a couple of weeks ago, those sort of anniversary interviews, stressed that he's someone who shuts the door, locks it, and retreats into Arsenal and a beer and his mates. He's only been in Parliament since, 2015? He's not a Westminster creature. It doesn't come naturally to him to do what you're describing.
Yeah, and unfortunately for him, the people who are quite good Westminster creatures, like Wes Streeting and Angela Rayner, who could be his deputies on this, are presumably...
Our rivals.
Exactly. Yeah. And another big observation, I suppose, is inevitably... It's a strange building, number 10. There is this sort of bunker bubble mentality which people talk about. And right now, these staffers will be walking in through the sun, lovely, sunny, warm day, and you go through the front doors and it's just sudden pallor cold. You can sort of feel tension and misery sort of seep out of the bricks.
Yeah.
And the problem, I think, here is that there were all these questions of sort of bullying, male dominating advisors, which is something it's a storyline I'm very familiar with. Yes, the guy who seems to have some idea about what we should be doing and won us the election, let's definitely get rid of him. Good thinking.
Right, this is, in your case, Dom Cummings.
This is my case, Dom Cummings.
Today,
it's now
Morgan
McSweeney.
McSweeney, who is the guru who people are blaming for the poor management of the parliamentary team.
And I warm to him more every day because his job is actually not parliamentary handling. You hire people to do that job for you. I mean, he's got a very important strategic job. He obviously shouldn't be worrying about whether the Prime Minister sent a birthday card to, Stephen Kinnock or something.
Yeah.
But you have to trust that you have good people in those roles. And then secondary to that is the idea that they have this comms problem all the time. We've not been explaining ourselves well. We've not been communicating well, which is true. But you can't just blame the comms team for what is badly thought through policy and what essentially is communicating out a message that you don't really have.
Yes.
You can't package these things up. And in my experience, the most sort of the most productive period of working in government, when there was sort of total clarity, everyone knew what the mission was, and therefore the communications were very strong. MPs, who incidentally, like sort of all dumb animals, respond well to firmness, understood that they'd be de-whipped if they didn't do what we wanted. That period of sort of August to the 2019 general election, everyone understood what direction we were going in.
Yes.
And there was complete clarity of prioritisation. Get Brexit done.
Yeah.
Schools, policing, hospitals. And then within that, you just had to sort of solve your own problems. Okay, we need a food strategy. I'm sure we do, but that's just not on my top 4 things that is happening. Let's talk about that in January. Or we are entrusting you, DEFRA Secretary of State, to do something sensible in the meantime and work the Treasury and not make everything our problem, I suppose. And the slight difficulty at the moment is that their only big sort of mantra is change, which I suppose is an honest thing, 'cause that was the front of their manifesto.
Yeah.
But change for the better? Change
They haven't defined it.
Exactly. And I actually think one of the mistakes they make as well is constantly banging on about how we've changed the Labour Party.
Yes, and that they won.
Right.
Like in every PMQs, Starmer always falls back. He has two things. One is 22 billion pound black hole. And the other one is, well, that's why they lost the last election.
Yeah.
And that's the only point at which his backbenchers will go, woo.
Yeah.
It's all they've got in the bank.
Yeah.
I mean, that period of super discipline that you're describing that I remember well in the Tory party, mid to late 2019, they were fighting for their survival.
Yes.
And the alternative was a government by Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
This government might actually have an embarrassment of riches in that, having just won this historic victory on a very low share of the vote, they may well feel they're in a stronger position than they really are,
Yeah.
and they haven't quite yet confronted what's coming down the road, which is defeat not just by Kemi, but by Nigel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually talking to someone on Results Day last July, and I was saying that these, a big supermajority like this is actually a real problem. I mean, when I've worked in government with no majority at all, and a very slim one with the help of the DUP, and with a massive one, and people can feel a little complacent when they think there's sort of safety in numbers on the backbenchers and they can essentially do what they want, and particularly the whip's office and the political teams, when when every vote really counts.
Yes.
That operation has to be so strong, so slick, and you haven't got wiggle room, so there's no U-turns.
It clearly wasn't, because last week they only pulled the bill, well, effectively pulled it. They pulled out the most important element of it halfway through the debate as it was ongoing.
Yeah.
They should have known the numbers before it began.
Yeah.
Instead, Liz Kendall went out to defend all the measures at 2 p.m. and by 4 p.m. she walked off and was told, actually, we're going to pull them.
Yeah.
So they clearly weren't in charge of the situation.
But if there's one thing MPs hate, it's being marched to the top of the hill, be sprayed with manure and then have to walk back down. And it only happened a couple of times whilst I worked in the Johnson administration while I was there, but a really obvious one is the Owen Paterson debacle, which really was Johnson's undoing in the end.
Yes.
Which was, don't worry, we're right behind him. For those who don't remember, because it does feel quite a long time ago now, Owen Paterson was hauled in front of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, and they decided that he'd broken several rules and he should have a 30-day suspension from the House, which could have triggered, it was enough to trigger a by-election potentially in his constituency, a very safe one. And initially, Johnson was minded to stick with Paterson, and there was a big effort from the Conservative Party to back Owen Paterson. And in the end,
because Owen's wife had taken her own life, so there was a lot of private sympathy for him.
Yes, which and it is awful, but he did. Everyone then read the report, including the Prime Minister, and realised he'd absolutely had broken the rules, and so. Then Johnson changed his mind, and everyone had gone out on Sky News and done interviews with the Telegraph and so on, and they felt very cross about it. The same thing happened with free school meals, and this keeps happening here. So, I spoke earlier about the old-timers who won't get a look in a reshuffle, and the new sort of thrusters who've worked out they're not even going to be MPs in 5 years' time. We've actually got a lot of loyalists in the middle who are quite fed up about having egg on their faces and having to defend stuff that they're so obviously uncomfortable with. And then it turns out if they'd slightly stuck with their instinct to begin with, they could have stayed out of the mess altogether and held some credibility.
Yes.
It really, it's so sort of melodramatic and in some ways silly, but Starmer's basic problem when he says, I'm not interested in politics, I think it's the same sort of sentiment that worked really well for Theresa May in the 2016 leadership contest, when she was coming in straight after David Cameron, who was accused of having his sort of matey people in Notting Hill. And she came in and said, I'm not clubbable.
Yes.
You won't find me having...
Above all this nonsense, I'll just do the right thing.
Exactly. And actually, that's what sort of caught her out in the end, because she was aloof, essentially. And Starmer's got the same thing. Every time he says, I'm not interested in politics, I basically think it's sort of nonsense, mean girls stuff.
Yeah.
He's exposing himself massively, because people think you're aloof and you don't want to. Why don't you want to be my friend here?
I think maybe it's grubby, maybe it's beneath very intelligent people to chat up and be nice to people who they think are intellectually inferior to them. It's what goes through a lot of prime ministers' heads, I'm sure. But to me, it's like wanting to play rugby but hating mud. Right?
Yeah.
It's a muddy game.
Yeah.
You're going to get muddy.